Welcome, Wargamers. This is Doug with 2 Plus Stuff, and today we are diving into some Slaanesh action. Okay. This video is requested by Jack Ballard, asking that we go through the Slaanesh allegiance abilities in the new General's Handbook, and we're going to do that today. If you have something you'd like covered, go ahead and click subscribe, leave in the comments down below. I read every single comment. I use many of them as inspiration for future videos. Try to give you credit when it's due. I know people are really into the lore stuff right now. I used up my backlog because I was sick recently, so I'm going to go back to those here in just a minute. But today we're talking all about Slaanesh. Now, this is actually one of the most fascinating of the allegiances here because it actually covers 3 distinct army types, and we're going to get to those in a second. Where other armies have various abilities under the battle traits kind of header, this really has one, but what it's saying is there's different types of Slaanesh armies. Now, kind of bringing in some background and stuff like that, Slaanesh has gone missing in the Age of Sigmar. We believe he's been captured by what used to be high elves or some kind of elf in that world. But we don't really know yet. GW hasn't explored that narrative quite yet. But in the meantime, his followers still exist, which means he has to exist on some level, somewhere. You have mortal Slaanesh, demons of Slaanesh, all vying for control, trying to make sense of what's going on. And the way that the game presents this narrative in rules format is it breaks it down into 3 distinct army types. And those army types are the Pretenders, the Seekers, and the Invaders. These are all different elements of what I would say a Slaaneshi army should be. But what they really do is what you do is you build your army, right? Before you pick a command ability, you decide what kind of Slaanesh army you're going to be. You're going to be one of those 3. And it gives you special rules based on that. So the first one is the Pretenders. Now, what makes this one unique, and I really think this is the standout, spoiler alert, you get to pick 2 command abilities. If you're rolling them, re-roll in case you roll a double one so you can't double up. But in addition to that, anytime you have a unit that's 10 or more models, you get to re-roll, I believe it's hit rolls? Yes. Hit rolls of 1 when the unit is 10 or more models. And that's in the shooting or combat phase. Now, what makes this one stand out above the others that we're going to be talking about is the fact that there is no downside to it. It's strictly bonuses. Granted, you're not going to have a ton of units over 10 models, you know, and then in a Slaanesh force, not going to be a ton of them, but you can do some cool things. The second one is called Seekers, which if you know Slaanesh lore at all, or at least the model range, Seekers are kind of like the horse equivalent. They're kind of demonic mounts they have. So this one's all about speed. Okay, so everyone gets +1 of their move characteristic, and that's also for moving and charging. If you had a speed, I think it's 10 or more. Yes, 10 inches or more. You get 2 instead, so +2 to move, +2 to charge. The caveat is, if you can charge, you have to. It's an all-aggressive army style, where you know, every time someone's within 12 inches, you have to roll, and if you make that roll, you have to move to the, not necessarily the closest, but you have to charge somebody. Your options are fairly limited in terms of controlling your army once you get into combat, because the thing is, once you know, that initial line of charges you want to have happen, but afterwards, you want control over your units, but they're still going to be running around screaming with their heads off, just hitting the nearest thing, not necessarily the nearest thing, but something. And so you have to decide for yourself, is the speed worth the control that you have for your army? Something I would say is that if you take allies, so 400 points of something, and you make them something other than Slaanesh, but works with Slaanesh, so let me see here. Yeah, so I have here the allies that can work with them. You have Brayherds, Gargants, Everchosen, Monsters of Chaos, Rotbringers, Slaves to Darkness, as long as they're not Khorne, because they hate Khorne dudes, and Warherd. If you take one of those heavier ones, I'd suggest Nurgle Rotbringer, something like that, that can really toe the line so that your Slaanesh side of stuff can bolt forward and just do whatever, and you have something beefier, maybe slower, to claim objectives and have something that acts as an anchor in the army. Again, this is a really cool ability, but you need to build your list around it and know how to play it. You need to know everything's charge range. You have to be okay with the idea that you might lose control of your units sometimes, but then being able to adapt and make plans on the fly. And the last one's called Invaders. This one's very interesting. You get 3 generals, okay? Only one of them gets a command trait, which we'll get to in a second. And they can't use, only one gets a command trait. but they can all use their command abilities as long as they're not within 12 inches of each other. In fact, it even calls out the command trait does not work if they're within 12 inches of each other, meaning you can have 3 generals, but they all have to be very spread out across the board. Based on if you're playing certain game types, this one literally will do nothing. By that I mean, say you're playing the open war deck, and you draw a deployment zone that kind of prohibits you from being 3 feet apart at any given time. Because remember, you need a lot of radius to be away from these guys. It'll just shut you down unless you have one guy bolt all the way forward, one guy stay back, and then one guy in the middle, and you kind of diagonally stretch yourself out. So keep in mind that that is a possibility. That being said, it does work with the Slaanesh fluff as far as like competing, I don't know, brilliant masterminds all trying to vie for control, a lot of backstabbing. Like I said, if they're within 12 inches of each other, nothing works. And so that is a huge bummer, because what you're saying is you're limiting yourself on options on where you can physically put your models. I don't want to make the choice between command abilities working, and 3 of them is really great. There's not a whole lot of command abilities flying around, but I mean, they're pretty good. And then the choice between that and then like, my general's going to get sniped off if I don't back him up 4 inches. Well, 4 inches is what puts him in 12 inches range, and you know, that kind of stuff. It creates a lot of congestion on the board. So as far as battle traits go, I think Pretenders is the all-star, simply because it's straight buffs. There's no caveat to it. You just get 2 command abilities and then the reroll hit rolls of 1, depending on unit size. So that, you know, that kind of feeds into army composition, but doesn't necessarily dictate it like the others do. Even if you ignore the +1 to hit roll, all stuff, sorry, not +1, the reroll hit rolls of 1, just having 2 command traits, which we're going to get to, they're pretty fun, is enough. So that being said, let's dig into those command traits. I'm going to throw some art up here so you're not just staring at me while I read this stuff off, and we'll review it at the end. Lord of Excess. Add the number of casualties inflicted by the general in the combat phase to the bravery characteristic of friendly Slaanesh models, units within 6 inches of the general in the following battle shock phase. This is actually super legit if you are having a melee blender hero as your general. By that I mean, say he kills 3 people, it adds 3 bravery to everyone around him. Depending on your army composition and how important bravery is going to be for you, this could be legit. If you're fielding mostly demons who have a straight bravery of, say, 10, probably not going to see as much value simply because they're not taking large hordes typically. But if you're doing more mortal stuff and you're kind of using those keywords, could definitely have some cool value in it. Devotee of Torment. The general can pile in 6 inches instead of 3 inches. In addition, the general can be selected to attack in the combat phase if they are within 6 inches of the enemy unit rather than 3. So this again adds a little bit of diversity to what your general can do, being able to move in and attack more. If you are doing the 2 command trait thing, having him move in and attack more so you can do more damage to get more kills to increase bravery, it's not a bad combination. Invigorated by Pain. Roll a dice each time the general inflicts a wound on an enemy model. On a roll of a 6, the general heals 1 wound. This largely depends on what kind of general you're taking. For a lot of the smaller like wound count ones, this probably isn't going to make a huge difference. But if you're taking something like a Keeper of Secrets, which has a lot of wounds, this will rack up over time. Supremely Vain. You can add 1 to hit rolls, casting rolls, and unbinding rolls for the general if there are at least 10 friendly Slaanesh models within 6 inches of the general when the roll is made. Largely speaking, I think you're going to have your general surrounded by troops. If you are particularly taking a Keeper of Secrets or some kind of sorcerer in some capacity with the Slaanesh keyword, this is definitely one to consider simply because it magnifies what he already wants to do. And Slaanesh units, they're pretty great and they're pretty easy to keep nearby heroes if you need to. Allure of Slaanesh. Subtract 1 from hit rolls for enemy attacks made against the general in the combat phase. This is an added layer of protection if you're going to have him be up in combat and things like that. It's not a bad idea, especially if you know your opponent has a lot of bonuses on hit rolls of a 6 or something like that. This can definitely help. Cruel and Sadistic. Enemy units must add 2 to their battle shock rolls for each model slain by the general instead of only 1. This is one that works really well in tandem with the first one, Lord of Excess, where your general's combat is dictating the battle shock happening around him. So he's killing dudes, increasing your battle shock, and the more he kills, the greater the debuff on the enemy battle shock. This can create a pretty huge swing. Again, it's all dependent on your general's ability to get into combat, mess some things up, and then stay alive. Okay, so stepping back, looking at the command abilities kind of from a bird's eye view, they all, generally speaking, have to do with your general being in combat. Here's the thing. I don't always advise that. If you're going to go with something like, what is it? The invaders, where you have 3 generals, you can give one of them this command trait and he can be the main blender guy, and it doesn't matter if he gets killed because you have 2 other generals and things like that. As far as having a general who is a super murder face guy, remember that Slaves to Darkness can take the Slaanesh keyword, and so as long as everything has Slaanesh, they can be a part of this. So someone, you know, riding a huge beastie or the Lord of Excess, something like that, they can do those kinds of things. I think if you're gonna double down on a combat hero, it needs to be something like where you're getting the most value out of it, right? You have to ensure that they get there, that they mess things up, that they don't just die turn 1 or 2. It requires work, okay? But I think that the army list, the way that they buff heroes, stuff like that, it does a lot for you. If you're going with the Pretenders one, I would try to experiment with different combinations, because a lot of these work in tandem, like the the debuff to your enemy bravery after you kill a bunch, and the buff to your bravery. You can really swing things that way. You could do the super pile in and attack, especially if you have a big guy. That's a huge deal. So yeah, just kind of play around, experiment. I think those 2 are going to be the biggest one. The mega move when you pile in and attack, and the debuff to your enemy's bravery are probably my top 2 contenders. And so now we're going to transition into the artifacts. Lash of Despair. In the shooting phase, roll a dice for each enemy unit within 6 inches of this model. On a 4 or more, that model suffers a mortal wound. Okay, so I actually said model, meant to say unit. This is good though if you have a combat character and you need him to stay alive. This can kind of just shed a little extra damage to units surrounding him, especially if you're going to have someone who can bolt up there full speed and just kind of grind into combat. Not a bad choice. Breathtaker. Roll a dice at the start of the combat phase for 1 enemy unit that is within 3 inches of this model. On a roll of a 3 or more, that unit cannot be selected to attack until all other eligible units have already fought. The Bone Splitters had something very similar to this in their battle tome, where you can kind of dictate how combat goes. It's extremely useful, especially if you run this character, sorry, this hero, up to a unit, get it off, and that unit is now disengaged, especially if it's like a super powerful, beefy, almost like a Death Star type unit where a lot of points are invested in it in terms of its synergies. This is a huge deal. Mask of Spiteful Beauty. In your hero phase, pick an enemy unit within 6 inches of this model. Subtract 2 from that unit's bravery until your next hero phase. This works super well in tandem with that command trait we talked about, where you -2 for each dude the guy kills. Even if he only kills 2 guys, now you're talking 4, right? Because he's near this guy. And then if you add the command ability, so that'd be 2 for each dude you killed, so that's 4. Plus -2 here, that's 6. That's a huge swing. If you're talking units like, say, Clan Pestilens or any kind of, I don't know, Gribbly guy, Crypt Ghouls, for example, or anything like that, this is a massive spike in battle shock damage. Enrapturing Circlet. Enemy units within 3 inches of this model at the start of your hero phase suffer one mortal wound. In addition, enemy units within 3 inches of this model at the start of their movement phase may not retreat. Like I said, if you're going to have a hero that gets in there and starts blendering people, having everyone take damage near him and not be able to run away, fall back so they can shoot and things like that, not a bad option. Icon of Infinite Excess. You can use this artifact once per battle at the start of any combat phase. When you do, for the rest of that combat phase, add 1 to the hit rolls of all units within 8 inches of this model, friend or foe. Here's the thing, I'm not the biggest fan of any abilities that buff your opponent, much like the Fire Slayers have a dude that, I don't know, he gives someone Urgle and they're really good and you can hunt him down and get more. I'm not a fan of anything that buffs my opponent. However, truth be told, if you line things up correctly where the punch that you give out to your opponent is devastating enough that their return punch, even with that buff, is not what they need it to be, this is a total win. You can do those kinds of things because so many things in the Slaanesh army have the mobility to get into good positions. You can get multiple charges off on the same unit, so you can really overwhelm them. I think as long as you're very careful and intelligent about how you handle this unit and, like, you know, are very conscious of the ranges so you're not buffing like your entire army or your opponent's army or whatever, you can do some really cool things. I would also check with your opponent to make sure that the unit that you're accidentally buffing doesn't have any special things on a 6. Like for example, if you were to accidentally clip, say, a unit of putrid blight things, right? They have a special ability that like mega multiplies attacks on a 6. So you need to be careful because you don't want to like have this backfire and you just wipe out your own unit. Fallacious Gift. At the start of the game, after sides have both been set up, but before the first battle round starts, you can pick a single weapon that an enemy hero has. At the end of each battle round which they use that weapon, that hero suffers a mortal wound. Truthfully speaking, this is if you look across the table and you see that someone is trying to do the exact same thing as you with like super blendy fighty heroes, you can tag one of their weapons and say you're not going to use that. If they were to tag my, say, Lord Celestant, who doesn't have a healing mechanic, but he has a really kick-ass sword with when he charges and things like that, it can make you be fearful to use your characters to their fullest extent. Okay, so as far as the artifacts go, 2 really stand out to me, and that is the Mask of Spiteful Beauty, which doubles down on the minuses to bravery, and so I think that's really key. Much like I do think it's key with the Slaves to Darkness, I went over that there. That bravery can be a huge thing and people don't always plan for. Now, in addition to that, I also really like the Circlet, which basically just shoots out mortal wounds within 3 inches of you, and people can't retreat. What it does is it takes options away from your opponent's army in terms of retreating, shooting, and things like that. Now, what I said before with the Seekers one, where you have to charge, I don't like it when I lose options with my army or lose control, and the Circlet does that for your opponent. They can't choose to fall back, they just have to sit there and take it in the face. Depending on how you kit out your heroes, which is I think is really going to be the standout skill for this army, is learning how to kit out your heroes correctly, that could be very devastating. Notice that there's not really anything to like, there's no defensive stuff here, right? This is pure offense. This is about getting in and smashing your opponent really hard, and that's why I go back to my original suggestion of some kind of ally who can sit back and man objectives, because everything in the Slaanesh army is about speed and aggression. You're gonna have to get up in there really fast and just snipe out the most important people first, because when you take that punch back, they're not very survivable, right? You need to hit them hard and fast. It's very melee focused, but when the second punch comes back at you, you're gonna kind of crumble a little bit, I bet, turn 2 or turn 3 in terms of losing a lot of models. So you have to be prepared for that. In addition to that, because this is God focused and not like specifically army, just be aware of the full range of models that you have. Taking things like say Slave to Darkness with Slaanesh keyword, so you have mortal Slaanesh people, you have demons available, you can do summoning, you have wizards, you have a lot of options going on, and all of those options kind of compound one another. Don't be afraid to have a wizard as a general and throw demonettes everywhere and try to protect them as much as possible. You know, Keeper of Secrets is legit. You know, there's a lot going on, and so I think there's a lot of game here. If nothing else, I think it can be said that no other Allegiance abilities let you play such a diverse type of army, right? Choosing those 3 kind of hosts in the beginning, really, they're all very different tones of army. And I think that's really fascinating. The only other army that I can think of that adds that much like diversity in terms of gameplay would be like Clan Scryer, which we'll get to soon, because they add an entire new mechanic. But this is very, very different in terms of you can build the exact same army, but if you, depending on what host you take, it's going to play radically different. And for that reason alone, I think that this Allegiance requires a little bit of extra attention. Someone's going to come along and figure out a way to make these things work in conjunction with one another. They're going to build the mega hero who's just going to go wreck face, and the rest of the army is going to be a supporting role, and it's just going to happen, right? It's going to be nuts because there's a lot going on here, but I think once you really settle down and crack the code of balancing target priority and aggression and model placement, as well as how to have your general get the most value for the command traits and artifacts and things like that. Like I said, I think it's a complicated puzzle, but one that is going to be super rewarding for the person who figures it out. So Jack, I hope you liked that video. If you want to see something covered, go ahead and click subscribe, leave it in the comments down below. Like I said before, I read every single comment. I try to respond to as many as possible. There's just a lot of them coming in. And so I try to use them all for inspiration for future videos and give you credit where it's due. Thank you guys so much for watching, and happy wargaming.